Hello, everybody. This is the first of the slideshows I'm presenting on various essays in the Best American Essays of the Century, which I hope you have, but if you don't, well, I'm going to walk through the essays a little bit with some attention to the style. And today we're going to look at Joan Didion's essay, The White Album, which is found on pages 421 and following of the book. It's a pretty long essay. It is so good. Joan Didion is considered one of the great stylists currently writing. And I think, as essayists go, she's as good as anybody alive. Let me give you a little sense of the title. The essay is called The White Album, and the book that it's from is called The White Album. It's the title essay from that book. And clearly it gets its name from the White Album of the Beatles. And this essay is set in 1968, which is the year that the Beatles' White Album had its influence. What is the importance of the White Album in the essay? If you read the essay, you'll see that Joan Didion has a lot of contact with musicians. She's a journalist and a person who hangs around celebrities a lot. But in particular, this essay deals with Charles Manson murders. You will recall that Charles Manson, well, you won't recall it because you're not that old, but Charles Manson killed a number of people in those years and was arrested in 1968. He wrote the words helter skelter, as you can see misspelled, with the blood of his victims. I should say he murdered. He was the head of a cult, and his followers murdered various people, including Sharon Tate, the wife of the film director Roman Polanski, and wrote the words "helter skelter" on the walls in blood. And the first book about the Manson murders by Vincent Billigosi was called Helter Skelter. Now, how that relates to the White Album is that there's a song on the album called Helter Skelter, which you can listen to. You can listen to the Beatles version. Marilyn Manson also did a cover of that song, but the Beatles version is better, and you can hear that song. But Manson felt that the Beatles were directing him to start a race riot, apparently, by committing these murders, or having his followers commit these murders. Anyway, the important thing about this is that Joan Didion, by naming the essay The White Album, sort of brings to mind not just the murders themselves, but the murders as a kind of a media event. By the time she wrote this essay, which was first published in 1979, the book Helter Skelter had already been out. The connection between the Manson murders and the Beatles had been out and well known. And what she really is interested in is the feeling of 1968, the feeling of that period of uncertainty and unrest in America, and also the media's role in creating and maintaining that. And for my money, that's one reason why this is an extremely good essay to read nowadays, because we are also here living in this pandemic, and in general living in the area of heavy media saturation, involved with events in such a way that it is almost impossible to extricate ourselves and our own lives from the media narrative about the events. And so, we are in this era that is similar in a certain way. The sense of tension and uneasiness, and also the sense that the media is always going to play a role. The White Album as an essay gives a greater sense of the kind of fear and paranoia and tension of a period than any essay I know of this type. It certainly if you read through it, it'll give you a sense of just how unsettling it was to live in and through that period. And I think we're living through a similar period nowadays. So I'm going to just look at a few passages from this extraordinary essay to try to explain what it does and to give a few techniques of Didion's style. So if you look at the opening sentences, it goes, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live. The princess is caged in the consulate. The man with the candy will lead the children into the sea. The naked woman on the ledge outside the window on the 16th floor is a victim of accidie, or the naked woman is an exhibitionist, and it would be interesting to know which. We tell ourselves that it makes some difference whether the naked woman is about to commit a mortal sin, or is about to register a political protest, or is about to be the Aristophanic view, snatched back to the human condition by the fireman in priest's clothing, just visible in the window behind her, the one smiling at the telephoto lens." Wow, that's quite an opening. Let me just unpack it a little bit and try to tell you what I see in it. So what we have here at the beginning is a certain kind of repetition, the repetition of the naked woman on the ledge, but notice how different that is from the other things that are going on in the first couple of sentences. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. The princess is caged in the consulate. The man with the candy will lead the children into the sea. Those are fairy tale. Those two, well, consulate isn't, but the two idea, princess caged and a man leading children into the sea. These are stories, right? Then she says we tell ourselves in order to live. And then we have this completely different non-fairy tale story in the next sentence, which we don't really understand what it means. And then what it means is really the topic of the whole rest of the paragraph. Another thing that's interesting to note is that Didion is using high style. I will say the consulate is one, but especially acidie. And I had to look up acidie, what that means. I was like, are we talking about an acid trip? This is, after all, 1968, but it really means sort of depression and boredom, a kind of an unwillingness to live. The Aristophanic view, Aristophanes was an ancient Greek playwright whose plays were a comedy. And so the idea is she about to commit suicide, or is she about to be part of a comedy? Is she about to be redeemed, snatched back to the human condition? And then that is an interesting question. Is her condition basically real, or is it part of a theater? And you see at the end, the fireman is smiling at the telephoto lens. That is to say, the fireman knows he's having his picture taken. He knows he's being part of a story. So that end of that paragraph, the fireman in priest's clothing, I don't even understand what that means, just visible in the window behind her, the one, that is the fireman in priest clothing, smiling at the telephoto lens. This is all being recorded by a journalist and becomes not just an event, but a story about an event. So you have all of these techniques together. You have repetition, you have kind of excessive detail, you have this idea of an event not just being an event, but a media event, and this happens at the end of the sentence, at the end of the paragraph. So I'm just going to go through a couple of other passages, and I don't want to take too long. I don't want this presentation to be long and boring, so I'm just trying to hit a couple of highlights. There's another passage later where Didion writes, "It will perhaps suggest the mood of those years if I tell you that during them I could not visit my mother-in-law without averting my eyes from a framed verse, a house blessing, which hung in a hallway of her house in West Hartford, Connecticut. God bless the corners of this house, and be the lintel blessed, and bless the hearth, and bless the board, and bless each place of rest, and bless the crystal window pane that lets the starlight in, and bless each door that opens wide, to stranger as to kin. It's one of those things that probably you've seen, or maybe there's in your own house. But she writes, this verse had on me the effect of a physical chill. So insistently did it seem the kind of ironic detail the reporters would seize upon the morning the bodies were found, which is wild, right? Here she is imagining her own, or I guess her mother-in-law's murder, and she brings it into story. She brings the whole thing into the idea of a story. If you're murdered, do you want a house blessing like that, a kind of a thing in your foyer like that basically says, I've let people in? And I notice, by the way, that the thing about this, there's a couple of things about this. One, this phrasing, and bless, and bless, and bless, and bless. This is a technique called anaphora. I don't know if you've heard this in another class, but when you repeat the first word or two of a sentence or clause over and over again, that's called anaphora. You see this in certain kinds of poetry. In the poetry of Walt Whitman, you see this a lot with these list poems. In certain verses in the Bible, certain passages in the Bible, it's a common feature of the poetry of the Psalms, for example. But anaphora is used a lot. This kind of repetition at the beginning of the sentence or at the beginning of the clause. So that's just a word to keep in mind, and it's discussed in Forsyth, and pretty much is one of those rhetorical techniques that you want to know and remember what it's like. The other thing is the placement of this final detail, the morning the bodies were found. She doesn't say, this is a real show don't tell moment, right? She doesn't say, when my mother-in-law in case my mother-in-law gets murdered or something like that, or in case there's a murder in this house in Connecticut. She doesn't say anything like that. She just says the morning the bodies were found, which is weirdly specific and also placed very deliberately at the end of the sentence. And the placement of something at the end of a sentence, this is one of Didion's really masterful techniques. She chooses to end sentences in ways that make you really pull up and be startled by them. All right, after this passage, we have this long passage. And so I'll just read it. In my neighborhood in California, remember her mother-in-law lives in Connecticut, we did not bless the door that opened wide to stranger as to kin. Paul and Tommy Scott Ferguson were the strangers at Ramon Navarro's door up on Laurel Canyon. Charles Manson was the stranger at Rosemary and Lena LaBianca's door over in Los Feliz. Some strangers at the door knocked and invented a reason to come inside, a call, say, to the AAA about a car not in evidence. Others just opened the door and walked in, and I would come across them in the entrance hall. I recall asking one such stranger what he wanted. We looked at each other for what seemed a long time, and then he saw my husband on the stair landing. Chicken delight, he said finally, but we had ordered no chicken delight, nor was he carrying any. I took the license number of his panel truck. It seems to me now that during those years I was always writing down the license numbers of panel trucks circling the block, panel trucks parked across the street, panel trucks idling at the intersection. I put these license numbers in a dressing table drawer where they could be found by the police when the time came. Okay, you'll see some things that are reminiscent of the previous passage and also some things that are different. I'm going to notice something in particular here is the door that opened wide to stranger as to kin. You may remember that what she's doing is she's quoting the poem in the previous passage, that house blessing poem. But she's putting this at the end of the sentence. Now, why is this important? Because normally in English we expect the end of the sentence to carry some new information. And so when there's not new information but a repetition of something we've already seen at the end of a sentence, that is a weird moment. It's not very common. And the name of it, it's called epistrophe. That's how you pronounce it, epistrophe, not epistrophe, epistrophe. And in Greek, where this comes from, all the syllables are pronounced. And it's exactly the opposite of anaphora. If anaphora is the repetition of words at the beginning of a line, epistrophe, or at the beginning of a sentence or a clause, epistrophe is the repetition of words at the end of a sentence or a clause. And you'll see this later in the same passage. If you look down, I took the license number of his panel truck. It seems to me now that during those years I was always writing down the license numbers of panel trucks. License number of panel truck, license number of panel trucks at the end of a clause. Repeating the exact same thing at the end of one clause that she has said at the end of the previous sentence. Something that happens in this passage and that happens throughout is this idea of extra details, Chicken Delight, or all these names. Now, what are the names? If you go through the essay, some people in previous classes have found that it's a little bit annoying to read all of these names. Some of them, it's annoying because she seems to be name-dropping all the celebrities she knows. Well, that's just the kind of journalist she is, or was at the time. She's really retired from journalism now, but she knows a lot of people, so she kind of hangs out with Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison and other celebrities, Eldridge Cleaver. Maybe these are names you know, maybe they're names you don't. At the time this was published, these names would be famous. Ramon Navarro was a former film actor who was killed by Paul and Tommy Scott Ferguson. The LaBiancas were killed by Charles Manson's gang, cult. And so those are going to be names that people know. Laura Canyon and Los Feliz are names of places. Do we need the names of places? What is interesting about the names of places, or the names of specific people, or the specific numbers of things? Forsyth, in his book, calls this the 14th rule. He's just making up a number, and the point is that if you make up a number or include a detail that's not necessary, people will sometimes be struck by that, by the kind of excess of detail. The same thing goes with Chicken Delight later in the paragraph. The repetition of Chicken Delight, I'm sorry I didn't put the second one in yellow, but you can see I put it in bold, is this extra detail. And it's just so weird and specific. Its specificity makes it memorable. And the idea of an extra detail that you don't need but is just there and that allows for memorability is another kind of another feature of her technique. Again, you have, as I said, more epistrophe. The license number of his panel truck, the license number of panel trucks, and then at the end, where they could be found by the police when the time came. And you may recall that in the previous paragraph, the morning the bodies were found, when she's talking about her mother-in-law's potential murder, is at the end of a sentence. The morning the bodies were found, where they could be found by the police when the time came. Like, she's putting all these license numbers in a dressing table drawer as a kind of convenience to help people investigate her own potential murder. That's the kind of fear and paranoia that she's living under. But the placement of that at the end of the sentence is really amazing, and it's worth just noting how carefully that's done. She uses repetition, she uses extra detail to make her writing more vivid. And now I'm going to just look at one more passage. This is a little bit later, and again it has lots of extra detail and lots of repetition. Driving a budget rent-a-car between Sacramento and San Francisco one rainy morning in November of 1968, I kept the radio on very loud. On this occasion, I kept the radio on very loud, not to find out what time it was, but in an effort to erase 6 words from my mind, 6 words which had no significance for me, but which seemed that year to signal the onset of anxiety or fright. The words, a line from Ezra Pound's In a Station of the Metro, were these: "Petals on a wet black bough." The radio played Wichita Lineman, and I heard it on the grapevine. Petals on a wet black bough. Somewhere between the Yolo Causeway and Vallejo, it occurred to me that during the course of any given week, I met too many people who spoke favorably about bombing power stations. Somewhere between the Yolo Causeway and Vallejo, it also occurred to me that the fright on this particular morning was going to present itself as an inability to drive this budget rent-a-car across the Carquinez Bridge. The Wichita lineman was still on the job. I closed my eyes and drove across the Carquinez Bridge because I had appointments, because I was working, because I had promised to watch the revolution being made at San Francisco State College, and because there was no place in Vallejo to turn in a budget rent-a-car, and because nothing on my mind was in the script as I remembered it. I will say that if any of you can write a passage this fine, you immediately get an A for the class. This is such a good passage, and one of the things that's interesting about it to me is just how much repetition there is in it. Budget rent-a-car is repeated at the beginning, at the end. I kept the radio on very loud is repeated in 2 words. 6 words in the words. Petals on a wet black bough, the line from Pound, is repeated exactly. Wichita Lineman, the name of the song, and then a line from the song, the Wichita Lineman was still on the job, repeated. She repeats the phrase, somewhere between the Yolo Causeway and Vallejo. It occurred to me that. She repeats that whole thing. Across the Carquinez Bridge, repeated. Because. Vallejo again. It's worth noting that at the time that this was published, although not in 1968, it would have been known that Charles Manson was then living in Vallejo in a state criminal mental hospital. And so that's no, I'm sorry. He was living in Vacaville. Never mind. Not in Vallejo. Okay, so, but Vallejo is not far between Sacramento. It's on the same drive between Sacramento and San Francisco. So you see all of this repetition. You know, if you look at it, really only half of the words are you know, maybe 2/3 of the words are original. Like, you know, only done once. The rest of the words, whole words and phrases are done over and over again. But it gives you the sense of the paranoia, of the fearfulness. She's writing as a journalist and interviewing revolutionaries, you know, potential murderers, actual murderers, people involved in revolutionary politics, but also musicians and stars of that sort. But you get that sense of California as being the site of this incredible upheaval, and repetition is her friend. Repetition and extra detail. So, just to summarize, repetition of the beginning of a sentence or a clause is anaphora. Repetition at the end of a sentence or a clause is epistrophe. If you add needless but vivid detail, Forsyth calls that the 14th rule. Why does he call it the 14th rule, not the 15th? Just so you remember it. Like, in other words, he's just making up a number, but that's the idea. Addition of detail at the end of a sentence, like the morning the bodies were found, or for the police to go through when they came. That kind of extra detail at the end of a sentence. I don't think there's a name for that, but it's really startling and vivid, and it's one of Didion's great techniques. I'd like you to go through this, if you can, go through this essay and just try and read it for its sense of paranoia. It gives you a feel of a time and a place like nothing else. If you have seen Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, the Quentin Tarantino film, you should probably watch that. Or anything, if you know anything about the Manson murders or that period, you will understand this essay better. It's not necessary to understand all of this to get the essay, but it's helpful. All right, thanks, and talk to you soon. I'm going to post this, and it can be the topic of discussion tomorrow. And I'm sorry that it's taken me longer to get through these than I had thought, but we're all struggling this time. Okay, take care. Bye.